My parents gave my college fund to my brother because he had a plan, so I let them think I moved on. But when they needed help, I had a surprise they'll never forget. I'm 29 now, and for most of my life, I believed my parents when they said they loved both their children equally. I was the older child, responsible and hardworking, while my brother Derek was 3 years younger and had always been what you'd call the dreamer. Growing up, I was the one who got good grades without being asked, while Derek was the one who got C's and D's, but somehow always had an excuse that my parents accepted. Derek was also the one with the big personality. He was charming, funny, and had this way of making everyone in the room focus on him when he walked in. Teachers loved him despite his poor grades because he was charismatic and could talk his way out of almost any situation. My parents, especially my mom, seemed to think his charm and confidence meant he was destined for great things. I, on the other hand, was quiet and studious. I spent my high school years getting straight A's, working part-time jobs, and building up my college applications. I knew exactly what I wanted to study: biomedical engineering, and I had researched every program in the country. My parents always said they were proud of me, but it felt like background noise compared to the attention Derek got for his latest scheme or creative project. The college fund was something my parents had started when I was born. They'd put away money every month for 18 years, and by the time I was ready to graduate high school, there was about $65,000 saved up. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it would have paid for most of my tuition at the state university where I'd been accepted into their highly competitive engineering program. I remember the conversation where my parents first explained how the college fund worked. They said the money was for whichever child needed it most when the time came. At the time, I assumed that meant me, since I was older and would be going to college first. Derek was only 15 and hadn't shown any interest in academics, so I figured by the time he graduated they'd have saved up more money for him. During my senior year, I started making concrete plans for college. I toured the campus multiple times, met with advisors, and even found a part-time job near the university to help cover my living expenses. My parents seemed supportive of my plans and would occasionally mention the college fund when we talked about finances. Everything seemed to be falling into place for me to start my engineering degree that fall. Derek, meanwhile, was struggling through his junior year of high school. His grades were worse than ever, and he'd been suspended twice for skipping classes. But around spring of my senior year, he suddenly announced that he had a plan for his future. He wanted to start his own business, designing and selling custom skateboards. He claimed he'd been researching the market and had ideas for innovative designs that would revolutionize the industry. My parents were immediately fascinated by Derek's business plan. He created a presentation with charts and projections showing how much money he could make. He talked about building a brand and eventually expanding into other extreme sports equipment. The whole thing sounded like teenage fantasy to me, but my parents hung on every word like he was the next Steve Jobs. That's when Derek made his pitch for the college fund. He argued that traditional college was outdated and that entrepreneurship was the future. He said he could use the money to buy equipment, rent a workshop space, and launch his skateboard company. According to his calculations, he'd be making six figures within 2 years and could pay back the fund with interest. I listened to this presentation thinking it was ridiculous and that my parents would obviously see through Derek's unrealistic projections. The kid had never held a job for more than a few weeks and had no business experience whatsoever. His math didn't even add up correctly, and his market research consisted of asking his friends if they'd buy custom skateboards. But my parents were completely sold on Derek's plan. My dad kept saying things like, "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that creates millionaires," and my mom was already talking about how proud she'd be to have an entrepreneur in the family. They started treating Derek like he was some kind of business genius instead of a 17-year-old with a half-baked idea. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in April. My parents called me into the living room and said they needed to discuss something important with me. Derek was already sitting there with this smug expression on his face, and I immediately knew something was wrong. My mom started by saying how proud they were of both of us and how they wanted to do what was best for our futures. Then my dad dropped the bomb. He said they decided to give the college fund to Derek to start his skateboard business because he had a concrete plan with real potential for success. They explained that college would always be there for me, but that Derek's opportunity was time-sensitive and needed immediate investment. My mom added that I was smart enough to find other ways to pay for college, like scholarships or student loans. I sat there in complete shock, unable to process what they were saying. $65,000 that had been saved specifically for my education was being handed over to Derek, so he could pursue a teenage fantasy about becoming a skateboard mogul. When I tried to object, my dad said, "Derek has shown real initiative and business acumen. This investment could set him up for life." When I pointed out that I'd already been accepted to college and had made plans based on having that money available, my mom said, "You're resourceful, honey. You'll figure something out. Derek needs this opportunity, and we believe in his vision." The casual way they dismissed 18 years of my hard work and planning was devastating. Derek just sat there grinning while my parents explained their decision. He had the nerve to say, "Don't worry, sis, when my company takes off, I'll pay for your college myself." The condescending tone in his voice made it clear he thought he'd won some kind of competition I didn't even know we were having. I tried reasoning with them over the next few days, but their minds were made up. They kept saying that Derek's plan showed real innovation and that investing in his business was a better use of the money than just paying for traditional education. They seemed to genuinely believe that giving money to a teenager with no experience was a sound financial decision. The worst part was how they framed it as doing what was best for both of us. They claimed that struggling to pay for college would make me more appreciative of my education and that Derek needed the money to reach his full potential. It was clear they'd convinced themselves that robbing me to fund Derek's fantasy was actually an act of love. After my parents made their decision, I had about 4 months to figure out how to pay for college without the fund I'd been counting on. I spent that summer working 2 jobs and applying for every scholarship I could find. I managed to cobble together enough financial aid and loans to cover my first year, but it meant taking on significant debt and working throughout college to make ends meet. Derek, meanwhile, was living it up with his new business budget. He rented a space in an industrial park, bought expensive equipment, and started ordering materials to make his custom skateboards. My parents were constantly bragging to relatives and neighbors about their entrepreneur's son and his innovative business venture. They acted like they'd discovered the next big thing, instead of funding a teenager's hobby. I started college that fall and threw myself into my studies. The biomedical engineering program was incredibly demanding, and working part-time jobs to pay my expenses made everything more challenging. While my classmates were joining clubs and having typical college experiences, I was either in class in the library or at one of my jobs. I was determined to succeed despite my parents' decision to prioritize Derek's dreams over my education. Derek's business launch was scheduled for that October, and my parents planned a big celebration party to mark the occasion. They invited extended family friends and even some local business owners to witness Derek's first official sales presentation. The way they talked about it, you'd think he was unveiling the next iPhone instead of trying to sell decorated pieces of wood with wheels. The party was as cringy as I'd expected. Derek had set up a display of his skateboard designs and prepared a speech about his vision for the company. Most of the guests were politely supportive, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when Derek started talking about his 5-year growth projections. My parents beamed with pride as their golden child played businessman. But within a few months, cracks started showing in Derek's grand plan. The industrial space he'd rented was way too expensive for his actual production needs, and the equipment he'd bought was more sophisticated than his skill level required. He was struggling to actually make the skateboards he'd designed, and the few prototypes he managed to complete looked amateurish compared to professional boards. Derek's biggest problem was that he'd never bothered to research his competition or understand basic business principles. He assumed that because his friends thought his designs were cool, there would automatically be a market for his products. When he tried to sell online, he discovered thousands of other people were already making custom skateboards, many with better designs and lower prices. By the spring of my freshman year, Derek had burned through about half of the college fund with very little to show for it. He'd sold maybe a dozen skateboards, total barely enough to cover the cost of materials. The expensive workshop space sat mostly empty because Derek had lost interest in the tedious work of actually manufacturing products. My parents started making excuses for Derek's struggles. They said every business faces challenges in the first year, and that Derek was learning valuable lessons about entrepreneurship. They encouraged him to pivot his strategy and explore new markets, but it was obvious they were worried about their investment. They'd stop talking whenever I came into the room if they were discussing Derek's business. Meanwhile, I was excelling academically despite the financial pressure. I made the dean's list both semesters and was already getting attention from professors who wanted me to join their research projects. I was also building relationships with classmates and starting to see opportunities for internships and co-op programs that could lead to great job prospects after graduation. But every success I achieved felt bittersweet because I knew it was coming at such a high personal cost. While Derek was playing entrepreneur with money that should have been mine, I was working myself exhausted trying to pay for the education I'd earned through years of hard work. The injustice of it ate at me every single day. Derek eventually abandoned the skateboard business entirely by the end of my freshman year. He claimed he was moving on to bigger opportunities, but everyone knew the venture had been a complete failure. He'd wasted about $40,000 of the college fund and had nothing to show for it except some unsold inventory and expensive equipment he couldn't even use properly. Instead of acknowledging their mistake, my parents helped Derek spin a new narrative about his business experience. They said he'd learned valuable lessons about entrepreneurship and that his next venture would benefit from the knowledge he'd gained. They seemed determined to believe that throwing money at Derek's dreams was still a better investment than my education. Derek's next big idea was even more ridiculous than the skateboard business. He wanted to become a social media influencer and needed money for professional video equipment and marketing campaigns. He convinced my parents that building a personal brand was the future of business and that he could monetize his charisma and creativity. I watched from college as my parents continued enabling Derek's delusions. They bought him expensive cameras, lighting equipment, and even paid for courses on content creation and social media marketing. Derek started posting videos about lifestyle and motivation but struggled to gain any real following. Most of his content was generic advice delivered with fake enthusiasm. By my sophomore year, Derek had burned through the entire college fund across his various failed ventures. My parents were starting to look worried about their financial situation but still wouldn't admit they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They kept insisting that Derek was building valuable skills and that success in the modern economy required taking risks. I was furious, but I kept my anger hidden. I let my parents think I'd moved on from their betrayal and was grateful for the character-building experience of paying my own way through college. I smiled and nodded when they talked about Derek's latest schemes and pretended not to care that they'd stolen my future to fund his fantasies. But inside I was planning something they'd never expect. Every slight, every dismissal, every time they chose Derek over me was being carefully cataloged. I was building my own success story, and when the time was right, they'd learn exactly what their favoritism had cost them. By my junior year, I was hitting my stride academically and professionally. I'd landed a prestigious internship at a biomedical research company and was working on projects that could revolutionize medical device technology. My professors were encouraging me to consider graduate school, and several companies had already expressed interest in hiring me after graduation. Everything I was achieving felt even more satisfying because I'd done it without any help from my parents. Derek, meanwhile, had completely given up on any pretense of building a career. His social media influencer phase had fizzled out when he realized that building an audience required consistent work and actual talent. He was living at home rent-free while occasionally doing odd jobs or joining multi-level marketing schemes that never lasted more than a few months. My parents were starting to show signs of financial strain from funding Derek's various failures. They'd dipped into their retirement savings and taken out a second mortgage to cover his expenses over the years. They tried to hide their money problems, but I could see the stress in their faces when they thought no one was looking. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek, who was supposed to be the one with business acumen and entrepreneurial vision, was now a 25-year-old living in his childhood bedroom with no job and no prospects. Meanwhile, I was building exactly the kind of successful career they claimed to value, but had refused to invest in. During my senior year, I started getting job offers from major biomedical companies. The starting salaries were higher than my parents' combined income, and the career trajectory was clear. I was going to graduate debt-free thanks to scholarships and co-op programs and immediately start earning more money than Derek had ever dreamed of with his failed business ventures. But I kept my success quiet around my family. When my parents asked about my plans after graduation, I was deliberately vague, saying I was exploring different options. I wanted them to continue thinking that their decision to fund Derek instead of my education had been the right choice. I needed them to believe I was just getting by while Derek was still destined for greatness. The first major crack in my parents' facade came when Derek got arrested for a DUI. He'd been drinking at a bar and crashed into a parked car while driving home. The legal fees, bail money, and increased insurance costs hit my parents hard financially. They had to borrow money from my uncle to cover Derek's expenses, and the stress was clearly taking a toll on their marriage. My mom called me crying about Derek's arrest and the financial pressure they were under. She said they'd never expected raising children to be so expensive and that they were worried about their retirement plans. I listened sympathetically while internally noting that they'd brought these problems on themselves by enabling Derek's irresponsible behavior for years. After graduation, I moved to a different city for my new job and kept my distance from my family. I told them I was working as a lab technician making decent money, but nothing spectacular. In reality, I was earning a six-figure salary with excellent benefits and stock options that were already appreciating significantly. I was also investing aggressively and building wealth at a rate that would have shocked my parents. Derek's problems continued to escalate. He got involved with a woman who turned out to be using drugs, and before long Derek was experimenting with substances too. My parents spent thousands on rehabilitation programs and therapy sessions trying to get Derek clean. Each crisis seemed to cost them more money they didn't have. Meanwhile, I was quietly building the kind of life my parents had always said they wanted for their children. I bought a beautiful condo, paid for my car in cash, and was already planning for early retirement. I was also dating a successful doctor and building relationships with influential people in my industry. Everything was falling into place perfectly. My parents started reaching out more frequently, asking about my life and hinting that they missed having me around. They seemed to finally be realizing that Derek wasn't going to be the successful entrepreneur they'd envisioned, and that maybe they'd made some questionable choices. But it was too late for regrets. Their financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. The breaking point came when Derek overdosed and had to be hospitalized. The medical bills combined with his ongoing legal problems from the DUI pushed my parents to the brink of bankruptcy. They were facing foreclosure on their house and had maxed out their credit cards trying to cover Derek's expenses. That's when my mom called me with desperation in her voice. She explained their financial situation and asked if I could help them avoid losing their home. She said they knew they'd made mistakes with Derek, but that they were family and families were supposed to help each other during difficult times. I listened to her plea with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, but it didn't feel as triumphant as I'd expected. These were still my parents, and watching them suffer was painful, even though they'd brought it on themselves through years of poor decisions and favoritism. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. I told my mom I'd see what I could do to help, but that my resources were limited. I suggested they speak with a financial advisor about debt consolidation or bankruptcy options. I wanted them to fully understand the consequences of their choices before I showed them what their favoritism had really cost them. 2 weeks after my mom's desperate phone call, I got another call from my dad. His voice was shaky, and he sounded like he'd aged 10 years since our last conversation. He said they were going to lose the house within 30 days unless they could come up with $25,000 for back mortgage payments. He asked if there was any way I could loan them money, even though he knew I was just starting my career. I told him I'd think about it and call him back. That night I sat in my luxury condo looking at my investment portfolio, which had grown to over $200,000 in just 2 years. The contrast between their situation and mine was stark. The next morning I called my financial advisor and had him prepare a detailed report of my assets and income. I wanted documentation that would make it absolutely clear how successful I'd become without their help. Then I booked a flight home and prepared for a conversation that would change our family dynamic forever. I arrived at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon and was shocked by how run down everything looked. The yard was overgrown, the house needed painting, and their cars were both old and showing signs of poor maintenance. Derek was there when I arrived, looking thin and unhealthy from his recent struggles with addiction. My parents looked exhausted and defeated. We sat down in the living room where just over 10 years earlier my parents had told me they were giving my college fund to Derek because he had a plan. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on me as I prepared to reveal exactly how that decision had worked out for everyone involved. I started by telling them I understood their financial situation and that I wanted to help them save their home. The relief on their faces was immediate. My mom started crying, and my dad thanked me repeatedly, saying he knew I was a good daughter who would always be there for family. Then I pulled out the folder my financial advisor had prepared and placed it on the coffee table. I told them that before we discussed helping them, I wanted them to understand something about my actual financial situation. The confused looks on their faces told me they had no idea what was coming. I opened the folder and showed them my current net worth, which was approaching $300,000. Their eyes widened as they saw documentation of my salary, my investment portfolio, and my debt-free status. I explained that I'd been earning more money than they'd ever made and that I could write them a check for their mortgage debt without even touching my retirement savings. The silence in the room was deafening. My mom whispered, "How is this possible? You said you were just working as a lab technician." I explained that I'd been deliberately understating my success because I wanted them to live with the consequences of their decision to prioritize Derek over my education. My dad asked, "Why didn't you tell us how well you were doing?" I looked directly at him and said, "Because you made it very clear that you didn't believe investing in my education was worthwhile. You thought Derek's skateboard business was a better use of money than my engineering degree." I continued laying out everything I'd accomplished since college. The patents I'd filed, the recognition I'd received in my field, and the job offers I was turning down. Meanwhile, Derek had literally nothing to show for the $65,000 they'd given him except a criminal record and a drug problem. Derek finally spoke up, saying he was sorry, but I wasn't interested in his apologies. I told him the issue was that our parents had made their choice based on favoritism rather than merit, and now they were living with the consequences. My mom tried to defend their decision, saying they'd thought they were doing what was best for both of us. I pulled out copies of my college loan documents and showed them how much extra money I'd paid in interest because I'd had to finance my education. I explained that their decision had cost me thousands of dollars and years of financial stress. My dad looked devastated as he realized how wrong they'd been. He said, "We thought Derek needed more help because you were already so capable and responsible." I told him that was exactly the problem. They'd punish me for being responsible while rewarding Derek for being irresponsible. Finally, I got to the point of my visit. I told them I would pay off their mortgage and help them get their finances back on track, but there would be conditions. They needed to acknowledge publicly that they'd made a terrible mistake in giving my college fund to Derek. They needed to stop enabling Derek's destructive behavior and require him to take responsibility for his own life. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that their relationship with me had been permanently damaged by their favoritism and that rebuilding trust would take years of consistent effort on their part. The conversation lasted for hours as we worked through years of resentment and disappointment. My parents were genuinely shocked by how successful I'd become and ashamed of how they'd treated me. In the end, I did help them save their house, but I also made it clear that this was a one-time rescue, not the beginning of ongoing financial support. Today, our relationship is slowly improving, but it will never be the same. My parents have acknowledged their mistakes, and Derek is in recovery, working a steady job for the first time in his adult life. As for me, I'm continuing to build the successful life I always knew I was capable of achieving, and I've learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding beyond anyone's expectations.